there are so many things in life that are paradoxical. Time heals all, in the end we're all dead. So long-term thinking, it's a good and wholesome thing. But I am going to die. In fact, I have this phrase now that I'm using at the moment. It's a little bit macabre, John. I call it dead in December. I at least allow in the thought that I don't see January. And then if I see January, we'll do the same for next year, okay? And really what I'm playing around with there is the question, at what point and around what things is it okay to be short-term? And it's the balance.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast seeking wisdom in business, investing, systems, and the art of paying attention. Each episode uncovers stories from practitioners who have spent years pursuing multi-generational excellence in their craft. We are seeking to understand how the world really works and how we can align our actions to it. I am your host, John Candito, and this is our series on the art of quality in investing.
John Candito is the founder and managing partner of the Phronesis Fund, the lead sponsor of this series. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. The podcast host, guests, and clients of the Phronesis Fund may maintain positions in securities that are discussed.
Our guest today is Laurence Endersen. Lar is the founder of Capstrive, an investment firm that strives to be patient, unconstrained, rational, and equitable. Lar is also the author of 3 books, Pebbles of Perception, What Owen Didn't Know, and The Compounder's Element, which we will discuss in today's episode. After I read The Compounder's Element, I told Lar that it was one of the most clear and concise compilations of investing wisdom that I have read. As you will see, Lar is uniquely curious, thoughtful, and has a wonderful way of distilling complex concepts into memorable phrases. Please enjoy our conversation with Lar Endersen. All right, Lar, welcome to The Art of Quality.
Thanks.
Excited to do this. So this has been one that's been in some ways a long time coming. You wrote this wonderful book, The Compounder's Element, which we'll get into. You published that last year, and myself and the other Art of Quality guys read it and said, we've got to talk about it. So I'm glad we get the opportunity to do that and many other things. But before we do that, as I was preparing for this, I sort of knew that you had done a bit of law, a bit of finance, a bit of venture capital. I didn't realize how many different things, for example, structured securities, leveraged loans. So how did that journey start, and how are there so many steps in it? Can you kind of tell us the story?
Yeah. So the start was accidental, John. The choice of law was accidental. When I was going to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And it was almost a little bit of a quiet protest, because someone had said to me, if you want to do law, you've got to be good at history. And all my friends knew history. I was terrible at history. And I said, well, maybe we'll see about that. I'm not so sure, And I remember in school, one of my history essays, the grades go from A, and if you get 40%, it's a D. And then they have a thing all the way down, E, F, and no grade. And no grade is the worst you can get. And I got a history essay back once, and he just wrote one word on it: gossip. Yeah, it didn't even deserve a no grade. Yeah, so I just think, well, and you've got to be really good at English. I was okay. Anyway, I did law. Partly, but I think it was because I had the points to do law, and it was sort of, you didn't want to be wasting points. And I should have probably did commerce, but anyway, I did law, and from there, sort of found that tax was interesting, and then accidentally found myself into tax, and then, as you rightly picked up, a lot of different things over the years, and I chopped and changed a lot. And I was thinking about this ahead of today. And the way dogs, a dog will chase a van, right? Just because it's there to be chased. So I thought, I'm actually chasing not a van, but the Venn diagram, the VENN, So where you get all these things aligning perfectly, work you enjoy, good people, the rewards are proportionate or disproportionate perhaps to the effort. And you always felt there was a sort of sweeter spot, in the middle of the Venn. Could you find that sweeter spot? Yeah. So I guess it was, life is to be enjoyed. Life is to be savoured. Life is to be, in some respects, gone after. And why would you stay doing the same thing if it's not giving you an awful lot of what you want? Now, I pretty much enjoyed everything I was doing, John. Yeah. But there was always, well, maybe there was some people, maybe I didn't like elements of it, and, constantly striving. Now, Kathy, my wife, would say I was doing too much striving, always looking for the next thing, and low attention span and a newness and fun fallacy. But I think it was just a gradual journey of more and more of those circles to align in a way we said, you know what, I sort of feel at home here. And there's a lot of things to get to a place where you eventually feel at home. Yes. An awful lot of things, and yes. You've been on a similar journey, John, I guess, mm-hmm. right?
Mm-hmm. I like to say I'm on career number 3. I enjoyed the other 2 careers very much, but it took, 3 careers to find, as you're articulating it, to find the thing that I believe I was meant to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So look, that journey is fun. You do a lot of things along the way. Law, accountancy, tax. I mean, they all help. They're all parts of, I think that's the interesting thing about investing. Lots of things. There isn't anything you could have done that isn't somehow useful in investing right. later, because,
yes.
It's just a culmination of sort of everything. So I certainly may have been seen as being a little bit flippant early on and not sticking with things. But the big one is people. The people have to be really, really right.
Yes. Yes.
If that's right, I'd actually compromise on other things in the Venn diagram.
Sure.
Interestingly, yeah.
Sure.
But if that's wrong, just, life is too short to...
Yes. As one of our mutual friends, Paul Booser, says, who do you want to do life with?
Brilliant phrase.
Yes. Yeah. I think a lot about, I actually have a list on my wall over my shoulder that I heard that question from him, and I went and sat down and answered it. And to your point, I would trade off a lot to do life with that group of people.
Yeah. I haven't heard Paul ask that question, but it's brilliant. And he lives his life that way, mm-hmm. so obviously. Mm-hmm. And look, that's the great thing about a question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a really clarifying question. Mm-hmm. So like my version that we might come to it in various areas is like, what are you solving for? Mm-hmm. It's sort of a constant, what's the thing you're solving for?
Yes.
And it can be different in different contexts or whatever. But, we just often... You get on the stream, you get on the river, you go at the river,
right.
And you're not saying, well, maybe there's a tributary here or there or whatever that might be more interesting, and or should we stop here for a while? Who else should be on the boat? Whatever. Yeah, I'm torturing the analogy a little bit, but it's just nice to stop and ask that question. So I love that.
Yes, absolutely. Related to that, there's a story that you tell where you were working in Australia. And you were near the Australian Stock Exchange, and at lunch you would go look at the ticker tape, basically. It sounds to me like that was a little bit of almost became a call to, I've got to get closer to this world, whatever this world is. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I followed Kathy, who's now my wife, to Australia. We had just met and she was going out. So I followed her out. That's how I ended up in Australia. And I was working with Dresner Bank, Dresner Clanmert at the time. And the office was near the stock exchange. And a lot of guys in the office traded stocks because they did a lot of mining, company hedging and things like that. And, most of it was gambling, but, sort of the Australian way. And yeah, it was pre-internet on your phone and stock tickers come in on your Apple, your list or whatever, pre all of that. And yeah, I used to just go down at lunchtime, and there was something captivating. People say, stocks aren't tickers, but, for me at that time, they certainly were tickers, and it was sort of interesting. And they moved around a lot. And around the same time, the Aussie government was privatizing a lot of companies. So I had, made very, very small investments in privatizations. And that then looked like easy money because those privatizations were priced to go. So you might have your stock in Telstra or Commonwealth Bank or something like that. And now you're done and you actually have a horse in the race almost, and you're looking at the horse in the race. And it's very intoxicating. And, for me, stocks were certainly tickers, not businesses then. Mm-hmm. But I said to someone recently, you have this combination of, variable rewards and the illusion of control, like you're picking the stock and then the rewards are variable. And that, that's a sort of a quite addictive mix.
Yes.
Yeah. And from there, then I just got interested in investing and started reading about investing. And, as one does, you get into the Buffett monger world and you start understanding, okay, what am I buying? What's the nature of the thing I'm buying? But
Right.
the spark was there, and I never bet on sports or anything like that before. So this was my first, I would say, introduction to gambling.
Right.
And then over time, you're sort of moving yourself away from gambling, hopefully into something else.
Right.
And that's been a 30-year journey so far. Yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes it still feels like gambling.
Yeah.
In the listed world for sure, but the fun was definitely seeded there, John. Yeah.
Sure. My father was in the 80s. He was what was then called a stockbroker. Now would be a wealth manager. And so I remember being very, very little, and he would watch CNBC in the evenings. It was the only channel that had all the ticker tapes. There were two of them that would flow on the bottom. And I had no idea what it was, but it just looked exciting.
Yeah.
It was probably at an era where I was watching, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or something. And so sort of like that, and then CNBC, and I didn't understand any of it, but I thought that's a thing I need to move closer to.
Yeah. What age were you then, John, did you say?
Oh, I would have been probably 5, 6, 7.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Nice time to get a start. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then much like you go through the journey of this isn't just tickers and numbers. It's, these are businesses and so on. So you've written a number of books along the way here, starting with Pebbles of Perception, which I think came out a little over a decade ago. But you've really beautifully kind of consolidated, added to a lot of the wisdom in investing and in compounding, not just in investing, but in life. So I often think of a line by Mark Sellers: if you can't write clearly, you can't think clearly. And if you can't think clearly, you're in trouble. And I've really enjoyed reading your writing over the years, and you write very clearly. So can you talk to us about the role of writing, just as you've learned, the craft of investing and evolved as an investor and so on? How has writing played a role in that?
For me, writing is very clarifying. Starting out in law and tax, where my original roots were, they're very, very precise. I had a wonderful mentor in tax who, I remember he saved a client, literally tens of millions, because there was no comma in a piece of legislation. It was down to that level of detail. Now, I'm not saying I'm that detail oriented, but words matter. But where I find it most interesting is if you want to lodge an idea in your head, and you can come up with a succinct phrase or metaphor or aphorism, some sentence that can lodge that in your head, I think, as a way of learning. And of course, you really don't understand something until you try to write it down. And that's for sure. I know that myself. And that goes to an investment case in a company. You say, why do I want to make this case? And then you start writing down. And you think, okay, maybe not. Is this true? So it's a very good way of surfacing whether something is actually true. And I think it gets a little bit more visceral when you write it down. And I probably like words. I like the craft of words. And maybe that's a bit from living too much in my head, too much reading, too much up here rather than in the body. But you go back and, some of the phrases that have stood the test of time over years, very, very simple phrases, well, they got to the essence of something. So, I look at, say, in this environment right now, where the macro world is crazy, it seems like we're really in a nuts time. And I have this phrase, macro for context, micro for conviction. Now, it's just 6 words, right? And there's nothing magical about those 6 words necessarily, but it might have taken me a few hours to craft those 6 words. So I like brevity. I enjoy trying to take something complex and really just, bring it down. So most of my books would have been maybe 3 or 4 times bigger than the finished article. And part of that is people don't have time either, to read a lot. So there's a little bit of a respect for readers' time. And I find it very joyful myself if I pick up something that's short and sweet and, easy to read and gets there. which actually reminds me of a random thing. Does this guy, I think Kilpatrick, he wrote a massive thing about Buffett once, a book, something Kilpatrick. I don't know do you know the one, John, I'm talking about?
No, I don't,
Okay.
but I have a guess as to where this is going.
Yeah. Anyway, the thing was massive, but he was quite funny and he was self-deprecating, and he said, someone came back to him and says, no, this is short and sweet and has no point. And of course it was anything but short and sweet, It was a monster, and but it was quite, it's quite funny.
Yes,
so
I'm thinking of I think it was Twain who said I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. And I'm always so grateful to authors who I think just understand that. To your point, I mean, I know your recent book, The Compounder's Element, I'm just flipping through here, it's call it 200 pages. It could have been 2,000, but part of the joy in encountering it is, and I reread it yesterday, and I can read it in a day, and there's always something where I'm reminded, oh yeah, there's that, and that's important, and you can't do that, you won't do that with a 2,000-page book. Yeah, the other one I'm thinking of, is we both enjoy a good joke, and so one of your fellow Irishmen, Oscar Wilde, brevity is the soul of wit.
Yeah, wonderful. yeah, absolutely.
So for the Compounder's Element itself, why did you write it? What kind of led to that?
There are two answers to that, John. So the answer that I'd like to put out there, and it's true, is that it's learning for me. It's a way of consolidating what I do day to day as a craft and what I do as a fiduciary for others. I'd be lying if I didn't say there isn't an element of ego in writing a book. You're saying, I have something original to say. You're putting it out there into the world. You're expecting someone to pay for it. Even worse, yeah. Even if it's a trivial amount, right? I did have an original thought around even the phrase, the compounder's element, and playing with what that might be. And when I went, I searched in Google for the compounder's element, and it didn't exist as a thing. And maybe this goes all the way back to your opening question about chasing novelty, John. Yeah. I find it enjoyable to find a thing that hasn't been said or done. Now, not everything under the sun has been said in some shape or form. But, there were a few concepts here that I hadn't seen elsewhere that made sense to me. I said, you know what, it'd just be nice to sort of own that, or just lodge that and put it out there, and then it's sort of done, and you've planted the seed and it's there for my kids and grandkids or whatever. So I felt I had something interesting to say, but yeah, why does anybody write? It's good, it's a good question, right? I think it's got to be more ego, John. I don't know. What do you think? Why do people write?
Well, I can tell in the writing that you've found joy in putting complex, important concepts in a clear and concise manner. So your chapter that revolves around, macro for context, micro for conviction, I think it's only like 3-4 pages. But, that's one of those things I think any of us who are in the investing game, we need to remember that over and over. And if it were buried in a 2,000-page book, we probably wouldn't come across it. But this, I almost look at it as a compendium of, I need to flip through it every few months because there will be some important concept in there that isn't as prevalent in my mind as it needs to be. So there's, I don't know if you think of it as a handbook or I know your investment checklist is in there, which is important. But it one of those, a list of things, not even a list, but a discussion of things we need to often be reminded of makes a lot of sense to me.
I should say, sorry, to your question, to be fair, to give myself a small bit of credit, I do actually enjoy writing and rewriting. Yeah. And all the writing is in the rewriting. It's like probably 20 rewrites of the compounder's element, and the same for the earlier books. So there is, you do end up with a finished piece of work, whether it's woodwork or something like that. So I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. I think that's like, why does anybody do anything?
Yes.
They like it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. I think that's probably the most. I think I have a better answer for that question if I get asked again. Why do I do it? I liked it. Yeah.
You liked it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. And I'm certainly grateful. I know others are too, that you're willing to put that in public. I think a lot of people, there's things of this nature and they end up in people's journals and they never see the light of day. And it's a gift in some ways, both to those around today and also you mentioned future generations. That that you put these things down in public and things that can live on past you and I. So let's get into a little bit of, I mean, we've talked about the journey being its own reward, which is one of the ways you open the book. And, broadly speaking, I'm paraphrasing a lot here, but the book kind of goes through this idea of for compounding, choose the slow, steady path, learn how to recognize a good thing, understand the cost of mistakes, and then some lessons from the road. And far too much to cover here, and I'd recommend folks pick it up. But there's a few things I'd love to double click on. One of them is on the notion of recognizing a good thing. I think that section 2 of the book, might be the best short consolidation of what does a great business look like. Obviously, it's not designed to be the 1,000-page tome on all the ways to analyze it and all that. But, you talk about structurally advantaged business models and asset managers and so on. That strikes me as a hard thing to compile. In some ways you're trying to say, here's different elements of quality, and that's always a hard thing to define. So tell us how that kind of came together.
Yeah. The catalyst was getting my head handed to me in bad businesses, John. So, mediocre investments. You show up to the conference call, there's always some bad news. I say there's two things, a result and a story. And, these companies are always talking about the weather or something else. You're getting the stories and you're not getting the results. And so from losing money in average businesses, now, of course, you can make money in an average business that's priced like a terrible one or whatever, and that's a trade and you got to do it again. But that experience, I said, it would be nicer to understand good businesses. What's a good business? And there's a few books out there, and there's Porter's 5 Forces, and there's the 7 Powers, and there's quality investing. And there's, there are some things out there. And I thought, but look, if I want to know and understand this for myself, back to your point earlier, write it down. Just do a list and start digging into it. And interestingly, probably I started this process maybe 3 years ago, and I was actually going to write a book on structurally advantaged business models. And I had a shelf here, maybe 15, 20 books that were part of the base reading for that. And I knew I got all these things together, which we can talk about some or more, or any of them if you wish. And then I said, well, actually, this doesn't need to be a book. Taleb always says, some things, they're an article, they're a good article, and people turn them into a book and they ruin it. And I looked at it and said, I could, expand this out into a book, but it doesn't need to be. So I then just sort of parked it, have it as a framework. So that was sort of the backdrop. And, I think, everything changes. The world is changing all the time. There's, 1 or 2 categories in there that if I'd written it maybe 5-10 years ago might not have been there. And I suspect the same is going to be true, particularly around trust and fairness to customers. And, what have been considered great businesses are where the customer has no choice and they're stuck in there, and you've got real pricing power against them, rather than what I say called an ecosystem enabler, which it's a healthy ecosystem where everyone's winning and no one's taking, too much out of the ecosystem. So, I think it certainly will evolve, but there was enough there for me to say, okay, now when I look at a business, I can go, okay, I've 10 categories in there. How many of those 10 are in this business? And you'll find, and I know, John, like you've done some great work on power laws, and I've been thinking about that a lot. Like your power law businesses, they're going to have a number of these 10 elements in there. Yeah. In fact, I suspect you're not going to find a power law business that doesn't have one or more of these characteristics in there. And I have an open question as to, in investing, whether you should ever invest in a business that doesn't at least have the capacity to have a power law outcome. Yeah. Like the way that, yeah. Okay. And I have some investments today where the downside is, virtually is, very, very low, but it doesn't have the possibility of a power law outcome. But because a power law outcome is so strong, and part of that is I'm very happy to have the thing where I'm not going to make the mistake and publicly look like an idiot. But if the opportunity cost is missing on a potential power law business, that's a massive opportunity cost. And I'm still so, and I think, John, you've given a lot of thought to this. So I'd be just interested for you to weigh in on that sort of question.
Yeah, as I read it, the book the first time last year and then again yesterday, I mean, you and I poke at so many of the same things. So a little bit later in that same section of your book, you talk about resilience and upside optionality. Language I use for that is, in any portfolio, you want to be set up to survive forever, because if you get knocked out of the game, you don't have the opportunity to catch a power law. And then you want to pursue power law potential, which is that upside optionality, because that's really where your returns are going to come from over longer periods of time. And yeah, I have that debate too. I mean, I structure the portfolio I manage as, I first try to answer that question, how do we survive forever? And that does include assets that may well, probably can't become power law outcomes. It's always amazing if you find something that can be a survival asset that can produce a power law outcome. I think those are incredibly rare, but they do exist. And then, of course, the other side is your power law potential, where, I always think of Graham with Geico, ex-Geico, his partnership underperformed the index. With Geico, it massively outperformed. And so it's, how do you find your Geico? But yeah, and I agree with you very much on I would be surprised if there are power law outcomes in terms of investments in history that didn't have one or many of the elements you talk about in terms of those structurally advantaged business models. Because it is, one way to frame it is, how does a business just keep growing, keep growing, keep growing, keep growing, keep growing? And anything that is not advantaged in some incredible way will be eroded away, competed away, et cetera. I always think of grocery stores, and there are exceptions to this, but in general, it'd be impossible to get a really good power law outcome from a grocery store. It's just when you got 2% margins and so on, unless you do some amazing things with capital allocation. And so, yeah, I generally agree with you, and I generally think a lot. I think we as a species have a lot to learn about, I'll use your words, resilience and upside optionality, and how to balance the two. I think a lot of investing these days is either let's go hard at upside optionality, knowing that we may zero out, but if we don't, wow.
Yeah.
And then I think a lot just is resilience, and we're too worried about zeros, and so we'll just kind of amble along. And in a world of index funds, I don't really understand why an active manager needs to be playing that kind of game. How have you thought of that? I mean, how have you thought of in a world of active management where my little framework is the logical things to do are either become a very good trader, which is a zero-sum game, some win, some lose, the winners get the spoils, or buy the whole market, which is indexing, which Vanguard solved that in the 70s. So, do that, that's indexing. Or try to some version of pick the winners, which is what you and I are talking about, and a version of what you and I try to do. So how have you thought of the role of active managers as the world of investing has evolved?
I think in the index world, I think about the world of active managers in a self-deprecating way as quaint, John. It's a stock picker, is a quaint thing, someone who thinks they can pick a few stocks, right? And I'll answer your question more sort of business-like as well, but like philosophically, telling the difference between luck and skill, especially with a portfolio of 20 or 15 or 10 stocks, the amount of time you'd need, 15, 20 years, something like that, is really, really hard. So it's a strange game where you don't know whether you're lucky or skillful. I mean, the spoils are amazing. And if you're, broadly speaking, it's a rising tide. Equities, broadly speaking, are okay. So if you're throwing darts at the median company, well, you possibly do okay. Best in Binder studies notwithstanding. So I think about it a lot in that I think if I had a skill, I think the most valuable skill to be is a brain trader, because I think the returns are insane. So I read all the Schwager, as you know, that you have too, Schwager, I should say, books on the traders, and their results are phenomenal. But you are then strapped in for the day. You are locked in. You've got to be on it all the time. And so this gets then to the journey. What kind of a journey is personally aligned to how you want to, who are your friends almost? Because I think of choosing stocks like friends in a sense, because that's the company, that's another part of the company you keep. And if you want the journey to be enjoyable, so for me, the idea of trading is just too intense. Index investing, well, I like the craft. Now, I might actually get a better result index investing. I do find it hard to defend active versus index because the index will capture the right tail. It automatically captures the right tail, and there's somewhere in between where if you're a really good active or a very lucky active, you catch the right tail without having to own a lot of the stuff that brings you down, or even just simply avoiding a lot of the left tail, which is what I think is easier thing to do than if you catch the right tail, wonderful. But I'm kind of more on avoid the left tail, get a decent result in the middle and let time be your friend. And, in the compounding formula, the 1 + R to the N, let N do the work. Yeah. So the traders are doing the R, letting the R do the work. And in a sense, if you're picking the right tail, it's a bit of both, but R is a big part of it. But for me, at the end of the day, I personally like to look forward to a conference call where the management team know what they're doing. They've got a good business. They've got a decent business model, and they are delivering, quarter after quarter after quarter. And if they're not, that they'll figure it out. Yeah. And we get we have such an indeterminate amount of time. Like you or I, we do not know how many heartbeats we get collectively. That's it. We just don't know. If how you spend your day isn't aligned with how you'd like to spend your day, again, it's doing, what you like. So I probably, again, I pick stocks because I like picking stocks. I don't pick stocks because I can say I think it's better than index investing or better than trading. Yeah. I like doing it. And I think if you do it in a particular way, where you focus on the N and obviously combining your resilience and optionality, I think the odds are, from a base rate perspective, are high that you're going to get a good result, provided if you live long enough. And I say, if you play the game 100 times, well, this particular way and the way you're doing it, maybe 99 out of 100 you're going to get a good result. There are other ones where it's, 10 out of 100, 5 out of 100, you get an amazing result, and the rest of the time you're taken out. And, the arrow of time is going one way for certain things. You can't go back and have a do-over. So, and it is interesting to watch how people, migrate from cheap to quality, but they tend not to go back the other way. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're so right. I can't think of a single person who, everybody starts somewhere. And so people they start trading, they start with, cigar butts, they start whatever, but I can't think of a single person who figured out on that journey, let's just say high quality businesses, high quality management, and then has said, no, I'm going to move past that. I'm going to go backwards or whatever. It's a very good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I very much agree with you.
And I don't even think it's necessarily backwards, John. It's just a different journey. But I think when you get a taste for quality.
Yes.
So I think John Huber is interesting to watch. I mean, he's had quality businesses, but then he's gone and bought coal, really, really cheap coal royalty companies or whatever, really, really cheap. And so you could say, no, I don't know John, or I can't speak for John, but I could say he's probably just very, very open-minded as to how he makes money. Yeah, he's just interested in making money. He's very open-minded how he does it. But I was listening to Chris Hone recently, and he was talking about he did this journey to quality. Mm-hmm. And I think he probably even recognized you might actually make more money, in some of the other areas at different times, because quality is well recognized right now amongst people. Again, this is assuming unless you get the real right tail, right? Because if you get the VC right tail, you've done it in quality. You're sorted, right? But I think he was saying it not explicitly but implicitly. He just prefers it. Yeah, it's more enjoyable. Question is if you were picking a wife, would you go for quality or value? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think the question answers itself.
Yes. Yes.
Or sort of categories of investment right now that I'm open to. I mean, the nicest are quality, and particularly with good management, trustworthy management who know what they're doing. And, I call it MARP, management at a reasonable price.
Yes.
And, I certainly think, Buffett's reputation of business versus management, I'm not so sure in today's day and age. I think the management, right? I think it's very interesting.
You mean the Buffett said some version of you want a business that can be run by an idiot because at some point it will be. And I agree with you there. When you study, take Bessem Binder since you mentioned him, right? When you study these businesses that, depending on the index you're looking at, the summary of his studies are over the last few decades to a century. He's done a number of these studies. The top performing 2 to 4% of businesses in any given market, and he's looked at a number of different markets, have produced 100% of the outperformance of equities versus government treasuries. And so then you say, well, wow, so we're in a 2 to 4% world. How do I get in on that? And yeah, to your point, I agree. I think it's hard to study the businesses that have been those power law outcomes and say any management could have produced this. Maybe for a while, sometimes they get in these positions where for 10 or 20 or 30 years, they are so ahead of everybody else, so they're impossible to compete with. But I think that's got a clock on it. I agree with you there. Yeah,
it's got a clock on it. And I do have some bone to pick with the Bessem Binder stuff as well. Not the results, but in some respects the interpretation of them. Because if you take a long enough time, that's guaranteed. Because
almost everyone dies. Yeah,
everyone dies.
Businesses, people, everything. Yeah. Yes,
everything. Uh-huh. So if you do it in 100 years, it's going to be all of them in one stock, right?
Yes,
the one that survived. So you bring that down to rolling 3 and 5 years. You get, and this is where trading. And this is another open question I have, John, which is, could you be a trader? Could you be an investor? Well, there's a huge continuum in between there. And how long do you take your time frame?
Yes.
So if I've said to you, pick a stock for the next 5 minutes, the next 5 days, 5 years, yeah. And then you can either pick a stock or the S&P 500, okay, for the next 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years, 50 years, okay? So I think depending on that time frame, you're going to have a different answer. So on the 50-year one, I'm actually taking the S&P 500 index. Yeah. And in the 5 minutes one, I am as well. No, there's some kind of some smile in the middle.
Very good way to put it. Yeah, I agree. Where you can, in theory, skill ought to be able to add substantial outperformance, but that's not an eternal thing. Nor, unless you're a trader, is it a 5-minute thing. There's a window. Yeah. It's a good point. I think a lot about this question of where do you compress complexity. And what I mean by that is a trader, a good trader, it's just numbers. And what the business does doesn't matter. Who the management is doesn't matter. It's just this priced, relative price of this business versus that instrument. And so in that sense, you're really, good trader, if you were to invest with a good trader, you're compressing a lot of complexity into their business to read an ever-evolving, complex adaptive system, and really a system of systems, and be well calibrated on the moment and make money and so on. But in some sense, your complexity is compressed into whatever the decision engine is for the trader and their ability to evolve as the world quickly evolves. And that's neither good or bad, but that's one way you can make a bet. I think for folks like you and I, we compress a lot of complexity into the businesses and management of the businesses that we invest with. And so, you get to whatever we consider high quality business. And in some sense, we believe that the management has the skill and capability to navigate that ever evolving landscape, with their business. And we're trusting them to do that. And that's partly why we allocate some capital to them. And so maybe that's that's got a window of, let's say, decades, maybe, for you and I. But on 100-year window, I think both would agree you'd compress complexity in some version of an index that's sort of saying, I want to bet on this aggregate system, call it modern capitalism and democracy and so on. And he goes, how do you think about that one? I mean, that's kind of how I think it through, but how do you think about it?
I like your phrasing, John. And I think about this time frame. See, there are so many things in life that are paradoxical. Time heals all. In the end, we're all dead. Yeah.
Yes.
And I even think it on a personal level. So long-term thinking, is a wholesome thing. Yeah, it's a good and wholesome thing. Okay. But I am going to die. Yeah. I turned 58 this year. In fact, I have this phrase now that I'm using at the moment. It's a little bit macabre, John. I call it dead in December. Yeah. I'm making the assumption that I'm going to be dead this December. Okay. Now, hopefully I'm not, but I could be. Right?
We're rooting for you. Yeah.
Thanks, John.
We'd like you to be around a little while longer.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm broadly, but not crazily, living my life, this year in some of the plans for the rest of the year, as if I at least allow in the thought that I don't see January. Yeah. And then if I see January, we'll do the same for next year. Okay. And really what I'm playing around with there is the question as, well, at what point and around what things is it okay to be short term? Yeah. And it's the balance. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Okay. But, eat, drink, and be merry, and then tomorrow you definitely will die if you do too much of it. Yeah. And, take cocaine and the rest of it. Okay. But there is a balance. And, as time has gone on, it was the phrase, I don't know who said it, you probably know, John, which was like, live every day like you'll die tomorrow and learn every day like you live forever.
Yes.
I don't know. I heard this somewhere. I forget where I heard it.
Yes.
It was Alan, my business partner, mentioned that to me, a few times as one of his phrases. And I think it's good. I assume nothing is permanent. And I sent you this little video clip that I've been sending to friends recently. There's an Irish comedian called Tommy Tiernan, and he just band on called the Mary Wallopers. They're an eclectic Irish band, funny guys, self-deprecating guys, and everything's working out for them. But they don't take themselves too seriously. And I kind of think, you want to be responsible, but don't take yourself too seriously.
Yes.
Responsible, but not take yourself too seriously. And I know that Succession, they say these are not serious people, all right? But I responsible people, but don't take yourself too seriously. And anyway, so Tommy asks them, the host, he says, like, everything's working out for you guys, like, what? And things are working for him. What could go wrong? And the lead singer goes, what could go wrong? Everything. And Tommy goes, what do you mean? He says, yeah, everything. Yeah. All of it, everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said it with a kind of an openness, yeah. But he had thought about it, yeah. And my phrase for that, and again, it's back to phrases, I say, like, at various stages in our life, we're either pre or post phone call. And that's the call that you get that changes your life. Like, you've got a bad diagnosis, someone in your family is very, very sick, or whatever. And at various stages in your life, you're either pre or post that phone call. And when you're in that pre-phone call period, enjoy it.
Yes.
Enjoy it. Because the call is coming. Like, the call comes for everybody. And then, depending on how stoic you are, you can go from post-phone call and you'll gradually, hopefully, navigate yourself to a period again, into a pre-phone call period.
Yes.
And, I've had both phases in my life. And at the moment, we're in a pre-phone call phase, and I'm liking that, but you wouldn't want to get attached to it.
Yes.
Because life, does its own thing. So, that's a off your point on the traders and long-term investments or whatever.
Yes.
Everything is in flux a little bit.
Yes.
But I do think this is where good management, they go with the flux. They know what they're doing. And, I personally feel that it's probably easier to identify a really good manager than it is identify a really good company. Like, if you had to pick a 1% company or a 1% individual. Yes. I think you know the individual when you see it. Now, clearly, the size of the company then depends on whether they can influence culture. Right. But you get a 1% person in a medium-sized company. Yes. Now you have a potential rocket ship there.
It's a great point. One way I like to say, I try to intellectually occupy Maxwell, Nebraska. And Maxwell, Nebraska is on a map of the U.S. It is exactly halfway between New York and San Francisco. And roughly speaking, obviously it's not perfect, but roughly speaking, I think San Francisco learned to find the 1% people. And New York tries to find the 1% businesses. And of course, both places do a lot of other things too, but I think, it's both. It's and then conveniently, Maxwell, Nebraska is not that far from Omaha, Nebraska. So it seems like a nice place to be.
Have you visited?
No, I have. The closest I've gotten is Omaha.
Okay, so that's a trip for someday.
Yep. There might not be anything there. I don't know, but
but who knows? It could be worth a look.
Yes, yes. And I think all of this comes back to, in some ways, what we're dancing around from the beginning here is, what do you want the journey to look like? That matters. So who you do life with, and also how you do life. I mean, you can imagine a world, and I think we're in it in some respects, where robots can build businesses. And that's neither a good or bad thing, but do we want a world where only robots build businesses and sort of humans have no agency in that? I don't think so. And we're certainly in a world, we have been for a while, where robots can run capital. And that's neither a good or bad thing, but do we want a world where robots price the value of everything? I really don't think we do. And the reasoning is very simple. We're humans creating a world to serve other humans. And so to sort of just give the agency away to the robots and say, you do whatever you think is best, which is sort of based on nothing, in some ways, it's not a very human thing. There's a line from our friends at Abdiel Capital that I think about often. So they have somewhere in the writing, they ask a really important question, I think, which is, what do we, meaning Abdiel Capital, what do we want to add to the world? And I'll just read it. They say, work done well and with pleasure. The craftsman is a better person for his efforts, and so is anyone who notices. Moreover, good investment analysis helps companies raise the world's standard of living. Enterprises work best when they have access to capital priced to reflect the value they can create. And index funds, by the way, do not price capital. They just mimic the actions of those that do. And I think that kind of gets at it, doesn't it? It's, some people want to index, and that's totally fine. So, some people want to price things, but I do think people care about their journey. They care about the results of their actions. They care about what gets built in the world and what doesn't get built in the world. And that all requires human agency and human action.
I love your choice of the word agency, John. I'm boring Kathy, my wife, with this word a lot recently because, social media, how it impacts people, how they spend their time, the addictive nature of I think someone called it cognitive strip mining.
That's a great line.
Right? And, do you want to be cognitively strip mined? Which is, if one is not careful, this is what happens when you scroll an Instagram feed or eat junk food where you don't know what's gone into it, or get prescribed to take some drug where the tests have been perfectly and fairly done, around the profit motive or whatever. I think human agency, this is the thing that the people who are scared about AI, of course, feel. I'm watching this debate. I don't have a view. I'm fascinated that there are people who think it's insanely bad, and there are people who think it's insanely good, and there are smart people on both sides of that debate. It's going to be really interesting to watch. But in the middle of it, agency and stopping to take the time to think about what one does, and you mentioned the word out of that quote there, craft. There was an author, Charles Handy, and he always talked about, the craftsman or woman or person signs their own work. Yeah. Like that family business. You've got a family business. Capstrive is effectively a family business for 4 families. And the craftsperson signs their own work. And there's something, very, very real and very, very authentic. And I think the authenticity of human connection, of human craft, of beauty, I think that's going to come back almost as a revenge, like the way vinyl came back. I love Spotify, but vinyl came back to all the AI slop that's coming. There's a guy, I can't pronounce his surname, it's Ted Gioio or something like that. He's the honest broker.
Oh, yes. I know who you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah. So he's written a lot of really good stuff on what's happening, art and music, and where tech is bringing all of that. And he sees a little bit of a revenge. In another context, I call it a revenge of the atoms. Yeah. It was the decade of the bytes, or the 2 decades of the bytes. And the bytes are really coming after everything right now. But I think the atoms are going to have the final say. I hope the atoms have the final say.
That's interesting. So one of our closing question, which I'll get to in a little bit, but as we go through the art of quality, we always ask our guests, what's your most memorable experience with capital Q quality? And just to comment on what you just said there, I'm thinking through all the answers, And I don't think any of them are. So people have talked about a beautiful, 200-year-old handbag they have that just gets better with age. Or they've talked about a great experience with a craftsman who handcrafts smoking pipes. Or they've talked about a manager who just really spoke into their life in a way that, but they're deeply human things. We're not going to get C-3PO crafting, doing the same thing. And so it's interesting you say that. I'm just thinking, and there's just this very human thing where whatever we perceive and value as quality is not just something in the world of bits, so to speak.
Yeah. So for me, John, to that question, Capstrive manages the money for 3 families. One of them is a gentleman in the UK, Darren. And Darren introduced us to an investment. So the way we work sometimes, somebody from any of the 3 families, so I'm looking at this, do you want to look at it in Capstrive or not, or whatever. Anyway, he was previously invested in this company, and we invested maybe 3 years ago. We invested in what turned out to be a pretty high valuation. Too high, but doesn't really matter. I mean, we're adults, we're investing the money, so that's all's fair in love and war. Like, 0 tears for us, no problem. And in early 23, we were restructuring that business, splitting into 2 businesses. So there was a recapitalization event of, taking one business into 2 because they each had sort of different capital structure needs or whatever. And as part of that restructuring, Darren took down his own shareholding and rebased us at half our original base cost. Okay. Now, there are people who have, a limited pie mentality that fight over the pie. And then there's somebody, you'll say, well, look, the smart people, let's grow the pie. Here we had a significantly shrunken pie, and Darren said, have my slice of the half pie. Okay. I mean, I've not seen that. I mean, I've seen the opposite many, 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 many times. And that particular pattern of behavior with Darren, he has done multiple times over, yeah. And possibly back to an earlier question, when you find, who do you want to do life with? And I'm 10 years in Capstrive now. It's the longest amount of time I've ever done anything, right? So with people like that, yeah, so it still amazes me, John, that he did that. Now, there are plenty of other family situations where you see acts of kindness that are really, really touching, but in different kinds of kindness. But I just think this was a absolute capital Q
quality. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful story, and you're so right. We almost just expect to see the opposite of that every day, almost every hour, whatever's on Bloomberg. You just kind of assume that's how the world is running, and in a lot of ways it is. And so to see the opposite of that, that's a beautiful thing. Thank you for sharing that story. Before we come to a close here, there's one other thing I wanted to ask you about from your book again, but it's much more than that. So you very kindly, you do something that almost no one does, which is you say we have an investment checklist, and a checklist is important. Lots of people say and do that. But then you actually share your list. But you share it as this has evolved a lot over the years, and it will probably continue to evolve somewhat, but here's where it is today. And it got me thinking, can you tell us, if we had a biography of Lars' investment checklist, could you kind of just tell us the biography? I think that's such an interesting thing to get into.
So it was born, the first version of it was born a little over 12 years ago when I was in Avoca, which got bought by KKR. So that's where I started the craft of doing investing as a fiduciary rather than for myself. So my friend Alan, who's now in the business in Capstrive, who you've met, he kindly brought me into Avoca to manage equities. I'd no business managing equities, John. So before we did anything, I really knew nothing. Yeah, but I was very enthusiastic, but knew nothing. Al and I sat down together and said, well, look, maybe before we start this craft at all, we should have an investment checklist. And together we sat down and created, it's probably 5-6 pages, very comprehensive. I still have it. It's actually a really, really, really good list. Yeah. And we used it for a while, but of course, That's too long. Yeah. And then it becomes, well, you're going through and nothing's going to check every box or anything like that. So then over time, I've started asking myself, well, look, in the investments we've made, what are the things that are really making the difference, right? It's the 80-20 principle again, the Pareto principle. Certain things that are making the difference here. Let's just sort of narrow down on those. And so every quarter, I go with red, amber, green on my investments on the checklist. And every quarter I update it. And then I have what I call a portfolio heat map as well. And I say, look, we try to green it, make it look more green over time. And then, maybe once every year or two, you say, well, actually, something happened in a company that's not on this checklist, or something material, or there's something on this checklist that it hasn't really mattered to us along the way. And so it's bit by bit. I think there's 15 or 16 things in there now. We went from a massive list down to about 9 or 10. It's gradually come up to 15 or 16. I find it very effective. And interestingly, like when I get mostly green on that checklist, those investments have worked out. And the obvious question back is, well, why don't you just wait until you get an investment that has all those green things, right? And I don't know, I'm stupid. Yeah, I don't know why I don't wait.
I remember you telling me this story a few years ago, and I'll try to be a little kinder to you. I, as I recall, you mentioned it is so rare. You can get a lot of green. It's so rare to get all green, and we need to act in the world. And so mostly green is often sufficient.
Yeah. And look, there are a couple of things where the green matters more and all the rest of it. But, fundamentally, it evolved just through experience, watching what's happening and adapt. Okay, this is important. Organic growth, for example. I just noticed, like, buying cheap companies with very, very low organic growth. There's no price you can pay when something is not growing. Like, almost. It's got to be insanely cheap, and there's got to be a catalyst. Organic growth is oxygen. Yeah. So, that's kind of lodged in my head. It's oxygen. And, so that came in somewhere along the way, usually from a mistake. In fact, pretty much everything is in there from a mistake. And yeah. So it is where it is today. And I say it's a map and a mirror. Yeah. Because you do want to go back and check your ongoing investment thesis. Back to our discussion on time earlier. Things change. And something creeps up on you, and suddenly the thing has gone from green to orange. Okay, maybe we take half this position off now, or third, whatever. So yeah, it's a fun and useful thing.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I loved the having discussed it with you and having known you and talked to you about investing for a number of years and so on. I loved both you saying what it is and also how you talk about the evolution and how it. I think that's the journey, right? In some ways, that's the way that we collect wisdom. And I love the explicit intent of write it down. I have my own version of what you called, I like that phrase, greening the portfolio, or every now and then you look and you say, all right, so my belief is amber, maybe a bit of red, maybe a lot of green, but is that good enough? It's a wonderful exercise. You kindly shared already your experience with capital Q quality with your great story with Darren. It makes me think about a line from your book that has stuck with me. Enough is a lot. I think there's so much wisdom there. It also has me wondering what is your next book, or what's your next frontier? Answer that any way you like, but I'm curious. I'm excited for the next one.
So there's two questions there, John. So the book, I'm probably on pause for a while. I think the bar to get a book out is high. I was a long way into Pebbles of Reduction, which is, reflections sort of, on the pursuit of more, which is, a big problem. And I had a lot of it done, but just don't feel it's good enough. There's just that it needs more work for sure. And a funny story about that. So a friend of mine was quite direct, and we were Kathy and I were staying down with him and his partner, And I was telling him about my writing, and I was saying, I'm thinking of doing a follow-up, from Pebbles of Perception to Pebbles of Reduction. And he just said, and he had said before he said it, he said, Pebbles of Nonsense. Yeah. And then I thought about that after. I went back to him a couple of days ago, and I actually started collecting Pebbles of Nonsense. I actually said, that's actually quite a good idea. What's out there that we think is sense but is nonsense? Yeah, that we've taken as accepted wisdom, but really it was in a particular context for a particular time or a particular circumstance, which is no longer relevant, but we're sticking to it. So anyway, they're there, but they're out there. We'll see. I mean, the frontier on the investment side, I've got massively interested in management, John. I really have, on the people, like the 80-20 rule. The difference between the 80 delivering the 20 and the 20 delivering the 80 is a 16x difference. And that's not intuitive. And if it's 100 to 1, it's a 10,000x difference. You know what I mean? So these 100 to 1 people are insane. And I've just got a lot more interested in trying to find those earlier in their journey. So I'm spending a lot of time there, and myself and a few friends, we're trying to collect, sort of collect these people. Hard to find. And then on the personal side, a new philosophy, which I'm calling peaks ahead. So like a mountain peak, peaks ahead. So there are certain things, and like you've so much time ahead of you, John, all of this is good, right? But there's certain things in life where your peak performance, your peak endeavor, your peak outcome, or whatever it is, in that thing is behind you, okay? So I don't want to be spending time on something where my peak is behind me. So I'm starting new things where my peak in that particular thing is ahead of me. So I could be starting from scratch as like a complete beginner, but my peak is ahead of me. So, I mean, recently one of those things is storytelling. I'd never done storytelling. I'd never done live storytelling. So I started from scratch. So my peak is definitely ahead because I'm starting from zero. So there are a few things like that. So that's the peaks ahead philosophy. And it kind of helps you stay young and young and sort of enthusiastic, because you can bring in enthusiasm.
I love that frame. There's so much optimism in that, in a way.
It's all about optimism, John. Yeah, optimism and enthusiasm, right? Okay? And there's an energy around enthusiasm that then is just nicer for the people around you. Now, you get odd questions. I had a lunch with a friend I hadn't caught up for a while. He asked me, and I was slightly taken aback until I took it to the company. He said, "What's your latest obsession?" Yeah, what's your latest obsession? But they're not obsessions. I think it's just nice. It's nice to be working towards something, and the past is, what you've done is done. Yeah, yesterday's bread is well forgotten.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not exactly frontiery.
I don't know. Storytelling's that sounds very much like a frontier.
But that is a lot of fun. Fun enough. It's very interesting. There's a thing called the Dublin Story Slam, and I've been doing a little bit of that. It's a bit like the Moth in the US. It's that format. Mm-hmm. As a matter of interest, John, what's it for you on the frontier currently?
I wasn't expecting that question.
Oh, sorry.
I'm publishing my first book, Power Laws Rule the World. So more of this power law stuff. So that'll be probably sometime next year. But a lot of the writing's complete, and we've got to go through the process of, as you spoke eloquently about, we have probably a longer book than it needs to be, so we got to cut it down and, respect the reader and respect their time and so on. But that's probably the big one, honestly. I mean, I'm a perfectionist by nature, and so understanding that balance between it needs, as you said rightly, there's a high bar. I think 2 million books a year get published. Why do we need 2,000,001?
Well, that's a great topic, John. I know already that's a book more than worth reading, because that's a topic that is not dealt with much and grossly underestimated. Like when Munger talked about, he thought about incentives a lot and still underestimated it. I mean, I think people who think about power laws a lot, and I know you're one of them, still underestimated, because it's in relationships as well. It's like a few it's a few decisions in life are everything.
Your book on Pebbles of Perception, I mean, that's one of the points it makes beautifully, is just, I think of those as power law moments, right? And it's when you you married your wife, right? Like when your kids, your investment partners, these show up absolutely everywhere where you choose to live. All this stuff where I think if you have that frame, you put it so well with the difference between 80-20 and 20-80 is 16x. And I would agree with you. I think it's more like 99-1. And so that's 1,000x. And yet I think even when we put a lot of thought into, let's just say who we marry, it's probably still not enough given the impact. And same for other, not for everything in life, but you mentioned what we eat, it's, and one of the things I learned from Pebbles of Perception that you just put so well is, a lot of little decisions over time become enormous. And so those, whether it's not necessarily the thing you eat once, but the thing you eat every day, that's a big deal. The thing you do every day. Sometimes I ask people, what's the thing you think is you must do every day? And of course there's brushing your teeth and all that, but there, every now and then you get something where it's like, wow, I start to understand why this person got where they did.
John. Laugh.
There you
That's
go. That's a great one. The best medicine.
One laugh is 2 tablets.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a good line. Well, this has been fun. Where can, 2-part question, where can people find you? And maybe before you say that, what help are you looking for?
Yeah, I'd love help on this management thing. So, any of your listeners or friends or yourself, particularly people that are intellectually honest, they know their stuff, they write clearly, they understand capital allocation, they're creating the right culture. I mean, it's insanely rare in the public markets. It's possibly insanely rare in the private markets as well. No reason it wouldn't be as rare there either. And it does tie into your power law book and work, John, because I think, those people, they're more than worth their weight in gold. And it's never really in the price, because it's the future decisions they're making. And Buffett was the perfect example. He started with a textile mill, right? So he's the retort to his own thing about a good and bad business thing, right? He's actually proved himself wrong in that observation, in a sense. Well, it's a different frame. They can turn a bad business into good business, but the capital allocation skill. So I that's one where it'd be great, because we can all go on a journey with those people. We can do life with those people. Why wouldn't you do life with those people?
Absolutely. I've got something I'm going to send you on what I think is some power law management after this. Brilliant. But the Munger line that's coming to mind is, I'm not saying Warren only had 10 ideas, but I am saying that most of the money came from 10 ideas. And you think about that, and then you think of, the Berkshire portfolio over the years, and there's been a lot in it, and there's a lot in it now. And I'm even thinking of the last Berkshire meeting, Buffett, Tim Cook was there, and Buffett said, we should all say thank you to Tim Cook. He's made more money for shareholders than anyone else. That's another one of those where if that's the world we're in, and I think we are, then to your point, if you can find those people, they are worth their weight in gold, and it's not in the price. And I love that. I will be a willing participant on that journey.
Excellent.
And hopefully we find a few more. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on The Art of Quality. This has been fun, as I knew it would be. Please tell us, listeners, where they can find you, and then we'll put those things in the show notes as well.
Sure. Just go to Endersen.com. So that's all E's, the Danish spelling of Endersen, Endersen. And there's a few bits there.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you again. This was fun.
Great, John. Excellent.
Thank you for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you know someone who would be a good fit for this format, please reach out.